Hey guys, welcome to the first episode of The Growth Fund, the podcast where we invest in your future. I'm your host, Abigail Callanan, here to talk about finance, cultivating a growth mindset, and being a corporate girly. So, today I want to dive into the importance of financial planning for our first episode. Lately, I've been really into jazz and blues, been doing my research, and I want to explore the intersection of financial literacy and the exploitation of black jazz and blues musicians. Really specific topic, I know, but let's get into it. So today I really want to focus on Billie Holiday, who, as you may know, was a very influential jazz and blues singer. Known for her soulful voice and expressive style, also known as Lady Day, she rose from a tumultuous childhood and became a trailblazer in the music industry dominated by racial and gender inequalities. She faced systemic exploitation, including unfair compensation and lack of control over her own work. Her legacy is not only musical, but is also a reminder of the financial and personal challenges faced by Black artists in the early 20th century of America. So, if I'm being real, research for this felt like a true crime podcast at times, just because of how much I had to dig into things, but it was really just an unveiling of a true a-hole podcast because of everything going on with the McKays. You don't know what I'm talking about right now, but you'll soon get it. So let's get started. When Billie Holiday passed away, she died intestate. For any of my listeners out there that is unfamiliar with estate planning terminology, that means that she died without a will. So her estate had been passed on to her husband, Louis McKay, who she was technically still married to, but had an estranged relationship with. Since they weren't divorced, New York law states that her estate gets passed down to him, which included her royalties. So, yet despite inheriting her estate, Louis McKay did not arrange or pay for Billie Holiday's funeral. That responsibility was reportedly picked up by a wealthy jazz admirer named Michael Grace. A sad matter of fact, Holiday didn't even receive a tombstone until nearly a year after her passing. Now, let's explore what we could gather of her financial status. What's important to understand is that Billie Holiday's financial state at the time of her death was not a result of one misstep. It was the product of a much larger pattern, a career marked by financial exploitation, systemic inequality, and a lack of financial planning resources that could have changed the trajectory of her life and her legacy. So, for most of her professional life, Holiday received minimal compensation for her work and barely received record royalties. And it wasn't until she signed with Decca in 1944 that she began to receive some proper royalty payments. Even at her peak, she was earning approximately 250K, which equates to about 3.6 million in today's dollars. Those earnings had been depleted due to legal troubles, health struggles, and financial mismanagement. When she lost her New York cabaret card, that impacted her earnings, and on top of that, her records went out of print in the 50s. So she rarely received royalties after that. I also have a document here from 1954 that shows Billie requesting a $100 advance to her account. That's roughly 1,200 dollars in today's dollars. So although it's unknown what this advancement was needed for, it could be a sign of financial instability. And as she lacked financial planning, it could be implied that she lacked financial literacy and support to do so. So again, when she passed in July of 1959, Billie Holiday had very little to her name. It was rumored that she had less than a dollar in her bank account and had $750 in cash strapped to her leg. But in a letter written by her manager, Joe Glasser, to her estate's attorney, Jonas Ellis, this confirms that her account balance was just $82 at the time of death, which is about $900 in today's dollars. The enclosed 1200 check in that letter, a late payment from a previous record deal, was one of the only remaining known payments tied to her work. Now I'm going to pause here and I'm going to bring us back to the topic of intestacy. Because Holiday died intestate, her estate, including any future royalties and rights, was transferred to her legal spouse under New York law, like I said before. So, following Louis McKay's death, his estate was divided among his new wife, Bernice Doris McKay, who he gave 20%, and the rest to his son from a previous marriage, Louis McKay III. Now, I want to talk to you about McKay versus McKay's estate, a legal case I read, so you don't have to. The premise is that Bernice later filed against Louis's will in hopes of still receiving her elective share, even though she was past the 6-month period. So, what is an elective share, you might ask? According to New Jersey's elective share statute, which was Louis McKay's domicile state, so that's what we're abiding by, a widow was entitled to one-third of the spouse's estate. Since Louis only left her 20%, this allowed her the right to her elective share. She really tried going that extra mile for that 13%. But she was denied because she missed a 6 month period, but was properly informed yet didn't file for an extension. So there's that. But essentially, what this all reflects is not just a personal tragedy, but a preventable one. And this is where financial literacy really comes into the conversation. With proper knowledge on this topic, she could have planned to establish legal estate documents like a will or a living trust. Billie Holiday being said. So, with a will and a living trust, Billie Holiday would have been able to name specific beneficiaries, whether that was family members, friends, or charities, explicitly exclude individuals like her ex husband McKay, and leave her assets to someone trusted. On top of that, a living trust would have allowed her to manage and distribute those assets even more intentionally, whether that was during life or in death. Wills are also subject to probate court, which means no matter what you outline in your will, it's ultimately up to the court. But a living trust usually allows you to bypass probate court and distribute your assets to your wishes. Billie Holiday could have her legacy preserved in a way that ensured her life's work went to people or things that she truly cared about. But as the story goes, Bernice sold Billie's intellectual property to Bicycle Music in 2012, who later merged with Concord Music Group. So Concord currently owns her royalties, image rights, and even publishing rights to her autobiography. While her music still reaches and inspires people around the world, the financial benefits do not reflect her own intentions. They reflect decisions made by others with little relation to her after her passing. This is why financial literacy matters. It's not just about how much you earn, it's about how you protect what you create. Especially for artists, creatives, entrepreneurs, understanding estate planning and intellectual property rights is so essential. Because when you don't decide what happens to your legacy, someone else will. So, to end today's episode with a bit of wisdom, um, a quote from Dave Ramsey, although I don't agree with him, says, "If you hate the people in your family, leave unclear instructions and no will, because they will all fight for the rest of their lives over your stuff." Thank you guys so much for listening to The Growth Fund. I'm Abigail Callanan, and I hope today's episode encourages you to think about your own financial planning journey. Bye.